Hi. That moment you realise you haven't been on since Halloween and you got your Halloween name up.
It's a cute Halloween name though. Like, you could just stick with it.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that just go like well with Kim at the start or can be easily replaced. Like usually my default for Halloween is, or if I can't think of any sort of costume, is Kim Possible, because it's like cartoon, done. Superhero, done. Like Disney character, done. Sort of. Like it kind of works for almost anything. And it's very easy dress up. How are you?
I am all right. Hi, Frankie.
Hi. Hi, hey, sweet peas. How you doing, Kim? How nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
Hey, love. How's things?
Pretty good. Back in lockdown number 2. Yay!
Yay! All of the good stuff.
Can I just say your hair has been looking super fabulous on the videos recently. You've been having this, like, because it's got a little bit longer, you can style it more, and you've got like a different kind of look almost every time. Great.
that is so lovely, but also style it more is a very, very strong term. That is putting what is happening here very strongly. But I'm glad that you are enjoying it.
I have dead straight hair. My hair does nothing. I can never really style it to do anything but what it does. So I'm always kind of a little envious when I see other people's hair doing gorgeous.
Yeah,
like,
with curly hair, it's just like, how's it going to dry itself today? Like, there is nothing that happens, but it is going to be different. I'm not going to change anything that I do. Like,
yep.
But some days it dries really nice, and some days it just misbehaves and it dries terribly, and there's really very little you can do about it.
Yep, absolutely. Oh, hold on. Oh, let's get as much light on in here as possible. How is everybody? Hi, who have we got? Hi, Bina. Hi, Evan. Who else? Hi, Michael Cox. Michael Cox, who doesn't have a what's it? There he is. There's Michael Cox's what's it. As it were. Hi, Duncan. Hey, Kitty.
I think I walked in at the wrong moment. Or the right moment, depending on how you look at it.
Potentially. I've got hold on. I think I'm gonna. Is my light okay? Am I kind of dim?
It's fine.
Can definitely see your face.
So, sometimes it's a bit better.
Yeah, I've got a new coloured lamp, or like a coloured light bulb in my lamp, and it's very exciting. It looks lovely. It's very purple in here, but it's not really showing up on screen at all. I was hoping that I would be able to join the bisexual lighting train, like Martin and Sean. I've been very jealous of the kind of purple backlit situation. Also, hi Belle, hi Ashura. Hey. Nice to see you. Hey Sean, hi Sean.
Hi.
Speaking of fabulous bisexual lighting.
I'm sitting on the wrong side of the room for it today. I'm sorry. I mean, you can take a quick look at it. It's still over there.
That is pretty good. That's. I mean, it has to be said that I think you are fabulous enough yourself. I think you don't even need the lighting.
Also, I've never seen this light, but it looks like purple fire.
That's a newcomer.
Yes, yeah. This is your Duncan's friend, right? Oh, it's lovely to have you along. Very excited. Always very exciting to have new people on. Ashura has not been coming for very long. And do we have anyone else in here who is relatively new? I think maybe not tonight. But
oh, sorry, I just realized I was on mute. So hi.
Definitely no obligation to kind of to chat if you want to just kind of like to sort of sit and be quiet. But yeah, like, you know, meet everybody. This is the Storytime gang, and it's lovely to have you along.
They are all lovely people.
We are pretty nice people. Everyone is so nice. Oh, right. Disrobing time. started a new book today.
Ooh, what you got?
Which is this one, which is The Travel Light by Naomi Mitchison, which is the one that was mentioned in Time War. The one that Red and Blue were like, oh my god, have you read this book? You should definitely read this book. Isn't this book amazing? Yes, it is amazing. I was like, I see you. Hint taken. Clicky, clicky, clicky. And honestly, I'm like 5 chapters in, and it is charming. It's so nice.
Who's the illustrator? The cover looks beautiful.
It is very lovely. I can hear somebody in the background. Does anybody know who is? Who has
yoga classes?
Jonathan, I think.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Jonathan, my darling, I'm just going to mute you.
There we go.
No offense meant, my love, but that was whatever was happening there was quite loud. But yes, yeah, it's a very cool illustration. It's all about a girl called Hala Heroes Bane, and she seems like a badass.
Yeah,
I know, right? I'm very here for it.
Very exciting.
That is a name.
Right? My rig is drunk. And oh no, my rig really is drunk. Hold on a second. Go home, rig. Okay. I think it's okay. I also ordered another future Storytime book today, which I'll need to reread to make sure that it is going to be good and suitable and that it will work in the way that I think it's going to work. But I thought that maybe sometime around the beginning of next year we could do Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. If anybody is up for some like massively melodramatic Victorian lesbians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Oh yeah.
That very much sounds like it's within the Storytime wheel.
You had me by dramatic and then you said lesbians.
It's ticking boxes by the sounds of it.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, very silly books.
They're so silly. They're so silly.
There's one about a glove which uses absolutely every euphemism you could have for putting on gloves and sex.
Is that Tipping the Velvet?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that one I have heard of.
Was that a TV show like a while ago?
It had
dramatized, I think.
Yeah, all I remember about the TV show was that it had Caroline Bingley in it, like 1995 Caroline Bingley. What's her name? Anna Chancellor, is it?
It was
And
Ren Jones's breakout role, I think.
No, she is all I remember about it, and she had like a big leather dildo, I think. And I remember reading an interview with her where she was like, "My children hate me."
Frankie, do you know what time it is?
Yay.
I don't. What time is it? Is it story time? Oh my god. Okay. It's story time. Very quickly before we begin, we always say goodbye to the catch-up crew, Tal, they're like all of the sessions are recorded and they go up on YouTube, and so at the end of them we like say hello to the catch-up crew, whoever is kind of watching them in catch-up. But we've had quite a lot of like catch-up crew love recently, so I thought it might be nice to just say hello to them quickly at the top of the episode. So hello, catch-up crew. I love you. Hi, catch-up crew. Okay. Right. Now, mute everybody. Hi, Maddie. So, very slight kind of content warning for this. There's a little bit of, I don't want to say, sort of self-harm. Like there's a little snippet of the golem experimenting with her own physical limitations. It's like very quick and not traumatic, I think, but I just wanted to kind of flag it up in case anybody found that sort of upsetting. But I think it will all be fine. Now. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Chapter 12. Early on the morning after Rabbi Meir died, one of Michael Levy's roommates woke him, gently shaking his shoulder. There was a rabbinical-looking man at the door asking for him. Michael went to the door and recognized one of his uncle's old associates. He saw the sorrow in the man's face and the discomfort at his task, and began to cry without needing to be told. We aren't sure when it happened, the rabbi said. A woman found him. We don't know who she was. The neighbors didn't recognize her. A pause, and the message in the man's silence. His uncle should not have been alone with a strange woman, but this would be kept between them. Michael thought of his uncle's friend Chava, but said nothing. He spent the morning weeping, awash in guilt. He should have visited like he told himself he would, made an effort, apologized, patched up their differences, helped him. Hadn't he sensed that there was something wrong? That afternoon he went to his uncle's tenement. Someone had already hung black crepe about the hallway door. In the bedroom, a young man with side locks wearing a dark hat sat in a chair next to the bed where his uncle lay. Michael glanced at the unmoving figure and then away again. His uncle looked stiff, shrunken, not as Michael wanted to remember him. The young man nodded distantly at Michael and then went back to his silent watching. The shmirah, the vigil over the body. Were it any other day of the week, there would be a flurry of activity, of men praying together, washing his uncle's body, sewing it into the shroud. But it was the Sabbath, the day of rest. Funeral arrangements were forbidden. He wanted to ask how he could help, but it was out of the question. He was an apostate. He wouldn't be allowed. Perhaps if he were a son, not merely a nephew, his uncle's colleagues would have taken pity on him, allowed him to play some role. As it was, he was surprised he was even allowed inside. A soft knock at the door. The young man went to answer it. A woman's voice in the hallway. The young man stepped back, shaking his head quickly. Here, at least, was something Michael could do. "Let me," he said, and went out into the hallway. His uncle's friend stood there, a picture of misery. "Michael," she said, "I'm so glad you're here. I should have known I wouldn't be let in. I should have realized. It's all right," he said. But she was shaking her head, her arms wrapped around herself. "I wish I could see him," she said. "I know," he said. Beneath Michael's grief, he felt the familiar ire building against the religious restrictions. How well did the man in the bedroom know his uncle, anyhow? What made him more worthy than Michael to sit the vigil? "You're the one who found him," he said, and she nodded. "I'm sorry," he said, hating himself, but needing to know. "It's none of my business, but were you and he—" No, nothing like that," she said quickly. "Only good friends. He was very kind to me. We had dinner together on Fridays." "I shouldn't have asked." "It's all right," she said quietly. "Everyone else thinks it too." They stood there together in the doorway beneath the crepe, a pair of outcasts. "I never thanked you," he said, "for the macaroons." A hint of a smile. "I'm glad you liked them." "Then you're doing well at the bakery?" Yes, very well. A silence. When is the funeral? She asked. Tomorrow. I won't be allowed, she said, as if to confirm it. No, he sighed. No women. I wish it were otherwise. Then please say goodbye for me, she murmured, and turned to leave. Chava, he said. She paused, one foot on the stair, and Michael realised he was about to ask her if she would have coffee with him. A hot wave of shame washed over him. His uncle lay dead, only a few feet away. They were both in mourning. It would be indecent by any reckoning. May God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, he said, the old formula rising unbidden to his lips. And you as well, she said. And then she left him alone with his thoughts in the dark of the hallway. I met an interesting woman last night, the Djinni told Arbeli. I don't want to know, Arbeli said. Together they were forging a batch of skillets. Arbeli shaped each one, and then the Djinni smoothed it and applied the finishing touches. It was repetitive, bland work, but they were developing a rhythm. It wasn't like that, the Djinni said. He paused and then asked, What's a golem? A what? A golem. That's what she called herself. She said, I am a golem. I have no idea, Arbeli said. You're certain she didn't say German? No, golem. I can't help you there. They worked in silence for a minute. Then the Djinni said, She was made of clay. I beg your pardon? I said she was made of clay. Then I did hear correctly. This is strange. You haven't heard of this before. Arbeli snorted. Strange? It's impossible. Raising an eyebrow, the Djinni picked up the wrong end of Arbeli's burning hot iron with his bare hand. Arbeli sighed, conceding the point. But you're certain? What did she look like? Light-skinned, dark hair, about your height, dressed plainly. Then she didn't look like a clay woman. No, you wouldn't have noticed anything out of the ordinary. Arbeli drew breath to challenge this, but the Djinni said, Enough, Arbeli, she was made of clay. I know it as surely as I know I am fire and you are flesh and bone. All right, but such a thing isn't easy to believe. What else did she tell you, this clay woman? She said her name was Chava. Arbeli frowned. Well, it's not a Syrian name. Where did you meet her? A slum near the Bowery. Our paths crossed. What were you doing? Oh, never mind, I don't want to know. She was alone? Yes. Then she isn't a very careful woman. Or perhaps she has no reason to be. She wasn't a prostitute, if that's your meaning. Perhaps you should tell me the whole story. And so the Djinni related the entirety of his encounter with the strange woman made of clay. Arbeli listened with a rising feeling of unease. And she recognized you as, well, different. Yes, but she didn't know what a Djinni was. And you told her? Why? To keep her from running away. But she did anyway. And when you followed her home, where did she live? East of the Bowery. Yes, but what neighbourhood? What nationality was she? I have no idea. The language on most of the signs looked like this. The Djinni took up a pencil and found a scrap of paper and drew out a few of the characters he remembered from the awnings and windows. Those are Hebrew letters, Arbeli said. You were in a Jewish neighbourhood. I suppose. I don't like this, muttered Arbeli. He was not a politically minded man, and what prejudices he harboured were mostly mild and abstract. But the thought of the Djinni causing trouble in a Jewish neighbourhood made him fearful. Mount Lebanon's Turkish overlords had long made a game of pitting its Christian and Jewish populations against each other, forcing them to compete for Muslim favour. The disagreements had at times turned bloody and edged into riot, fanned by accusations of Christian blood in Jewish bread, a claim that always struck Arbeli as ridiculous on its face, though he knew many were willing to believe it. Of course, the Jews of the Lower East Side were European, not Syrian, but here they were by far the largest community, and it seemed more than plausible that they'd bear a grudge on their brethren's behalf. "You told her too much," Arbeli said, "and if she repeats it, no one will believe her. That doesn't mean she can't cause trouble. What if she comes here and starts spreading rumours? Or worse, what if she tells the Jews of the Lower East Side that she's discovered a dangerous and terrible creature that's living with the Syrians on Washington Street? Then we'll laugh at her and say she's mad. Will you laugh at an entire mob? Will you laugh when they loot Sam's store or set fire to the Fadul's coffee house? But why would they? They need no reason," shouted Arbeli. "Why can't you understand? Men need no reason to cause mischief, only an excuse. You live among good, hard-working people, and your carelessness puts them in danger. For God's sake, don't destroy their lives to suit your whims." Djinni was startled by the man's vehemence. He'd never seen Arbeli so angry. "All right," he said. "I apologise. I won't go back there again." "Good," said Arbeli in surprise. He'd been expecting a fight. "That's good. Thank you." And together they resumed their work. A few nights later, the city was hit with the first real snowfall of the season. The Djinni stood at his window and watched the city silently disappear. He'd seen snow before, drifting dry and white across the desert floor and shining from the high peaks. But this snow softened all it touched, rounding the sharp edges of buildings and rooftops. He watched until it stopped falling, and then he went down to the street. He walked to the docks through the unbroken white, feeling the flakes crumple beneath his feet. Tethered boats bobbed in the black water, their decks and rigging lined with snow. Somewhere nearby there was a saloon, the men's voices and laughter carried in the still air. It was a tranquility unlike any he'd experienced in this city, but it felt fragile, a moment he'd managed to steal. In the morning he'd be back to making skillets, playing the Bedouin apprentice, living in secret. He remembered the rush of gladness he'd felt when he told the woman what he was, as though for a moment he'd been freed. Occasionally a small voice spoke up inside him, saying, "You're a fool for not going home." But he could barely consider the thought before crushing it beneath 1,000 fears and objections. Even if he survived the ocean crossing, he could not return to his glass palace, his earlier life, bound as he was. He'd be forced to seek refuge in the Djinn habitations, among his kind but utterly apart, pitied and feared, pointed out as a cautionary example to the wayward young. Avoid humankind, little one, or this will be your end. No. If he must live estranged from his own kind, then let it be in New York. He would find a way to free himself. And if he couldn't, well then, he supposed he would die here. The golem sat in her window and watched the snow fall. The cold seeped in around the window frame, and she pulled her cloak tighter against it. She discovered that although the chill itself did not bother her, it stiffened the clay of her body, turning her restless and irritated. She'd taken to wearing her cloak even in her room, but it didn't help much. Already her legs ached, and it was only 2 in the morning. The snow was beautiful, though. She wished she could go out in it and feel what it was like while it was still pristine and fresh. She imagined the rabbi's new grave across the river in Brooklyn, lying beneath a growing white blanket. She would visit him soon, she thought, but first she'd have to figure out how. She had never been to Brooklyn. She'd barely been out of the Lower East Side. And were women permitted in a cemetery? How could she ask anyone and not reveal her ignorance? The rabbi's death had revealed how little she knew of the culture in which she lived. Within moments of her terrible discovery, the neighbours had begun to play their roles, following the script they all knew by heart. The fetching of the doctor, the covering of the mirror. When she'd encountered the young man sitting the vigil the next day, she'd been appalled by the force of his distaste, the wrongness of her presence. She'd appreciated Michael's anger on her behalf, but he at least understood what he trespassed against, while she merely blundered in the dark. Michael. She suspected that even without her ability, she would have known what it was he wanted to ask her in the hallway. She was thankful that he hadn't. Judge a man by his actions, not his thoughts. The rabbi was right. Michael was a good person, and she was glad to have met him again. Perhaps they would encounter each other occasionally, on the street or in the bakery. They might be acquaintances, friends. She hoped he would accept that. Meanwhile, her life, it seemed, went on. At work, Mrs. Radzin offered her condolences and mentioned that Mr. Radzin would be paying their respects at Shiva at the rabbi's tenement. The Golem wondered, did Mrs. Radzin stay home because women weren't allowed, or simply to take care of the children? How was she to know these things? Anna and Mrs. Radzin both offered to take the Golem's shift at the register so that she could work quietly in the back. It was a kindness, and she accepted thankfully. The solitude allowed her to think hard about the events of the previous days and register that they'd truly happened. The encounter with the glowing man, in particular, seemed like something she might have imagined. He'd left no real mark or trace of his existence, save in her memory. She winced, thinking of how she'd revealed her secret to him. But it had been almost beyond her control. He told her his own so easily that for a moment her caution had seemed excessive, even silly. And then he'd asked, "What are you?" And the frank, eager curiosity of the question had broken her open. At least she'd run from him before she could do any more damage. It had been a chance encounter, an aberration. It wouldn't be repeated. But in unguarded moments, mixing dough or counting stitches, her thoughts came back to him, pondering what he'd said. He was a Djinni. But what was that? Why did his face glow the way it did? How had he come here by accident? Sometimes she even imagined searching him out, going to Washington Street and asking him her questions. Then she would catch hold of her thoughts and turn them to something else. It was too dangerous a fantasy to entertain. There was one more loose thread about that night that still needed her attention. She'd thought long and hard about the envelope she'd taken from the rabbi's hand, with its small square of folded paper. She hadn't opened it again, hadn't trusted herself not to unfold the paper all the way. She wondered now if the rabbi had even meant to give it to her. Wouldn't he at least have put her name on the envelope or disguised its contents somehow? But all this speculation was useless. She would never know for certain. Briefly, she considered burning it, but the thought only made her clutch at it more tightly. Whatever the rabbi's intentions, the envelope had come to her, and she couldn't destroy it. The question then became where to put it. She couldn't keep it at the boarding house. Her landlady might find it, or the house might burn down. The bakery was even riskier. It seemed best to keep it with her. And so, taking some of the money from the cookie tin beneath her bed, she went to a jeweller's and bought a large brass locket that hung from a sturdy chain. The locket was plain and oblong, with rounded corners. There was just enough room inside for the square of paper, folded tightly. She closed the clasp, hung the chain about her neck, and tucked the locket inside her shirtwaist. The collar was high enough to hide most of the chain. One would have to look hard to see its glitter at the nape of her neck. Now, as she stared out at the snow, the locket rested against her skin, cool and secret. It was an odd sensation, but already she was growing used to it. Soon, she supposed, she would hardly notice. On the last night of Shiva, Michael Levy stood in the corner of his uncle's parlour and listened to the mourner's Kaddish as it was read yet again. Its sad, swaying rhythm had pulled at him ever since the funeral service. He felt ill. He passed a hand over his forehead. He was sweating, even in the cold air of the room. The men in the parlour were a wall of black coats, their yarmulkes bobbing up and down as they chanted in deep, froggy voices. At the cemetery in Brooklyn, he'd stood next to the open grave and gathered a handful of frozen dirt, then extended his arm and opened his hand. The frozen clumps had struck the plain pine coffin with a flat and hollow sound. The coffin had seemed too small, too far away, like something at the bottom of a well. May God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. The prescribed words of mourning, the words that had come to his lips in the hallway with his uncle's friend. He'd heard them dozens of times in those few short days, and they were starting to grate on his nerves. Why among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? Why not among the mourners of the world? So parochial, so small-minded, as though the only loss that mattered was the ancient loss of the temple, and all other losses merely reflected it. He knew that it was meant to remind the mourner that he was still part of a community and among the living. But Michael had his community, his friends from school, his colleagues at the sheltering house, his brothers and sisters in the Socialist Labour Party. He didn't need these pious strangers. He'd seen their sideways glances at him, taking in the apostate nephew. Let them judge, he thought. It was the last night. They'd all be rid of each other soon enough. The black-hatted men came and went. They stood by the parlour table eating hard-boiled eggs and slices of bread, talking quietly. A few times, Michael saw older rabbis, men he vaguely remembered as friends of his uncle's, scanning the bookshelves, looking for something. Each one would come to the end of the shelves and frown, disappointed, and then glance about guiltily and move on. Were they browsing for valuable volumes they might appropriate? Personal covetousness, even at Shiva? He smirked without mirth. So much for the purity of mourning. Well, they could have it all. He was the designated heir to what little there was, but he planned to donate most of it. He had nowhere to put the furniture, no use for the religious items. After everyone was gone, he roamed about the rooms with a box, setting aside the few things he would keep. The silver-plated tea set of which his aunt had been so proud. Her shawls and jewellery which he discovered in a wardrobe drawer. In the same drawer, a pouch containing a water-stained billfold and a broken watch. The watch had once been fine. He'd never seen his uncle carry it. In the billfold was both American and what looked like German currency. He added both to the box, wondering if they were relics of his uncle's crossing. Personal correspondence, the few family daguerreotypes in frames, including, hidden in a drawer, his own parents' wedding portrait. His mother, a round-cheeked girl, peeking out from beneath a lace veil spangled with flowers. His father, tall and thin in a silk hat, staring not at the camera or his new wife, but off to one side, as if already planning his escape. The old anger at his father rose briefly before dissolving back into sorrow. These he added to their brethren. Under the bed he found a satchel half full of dilapidated old books. These he added to their brethren on the bookshelves. He knew of a charity that sent books to new Jewish congregations in the Middle West. No doubt they would be interested. Under the cloth on the parlour table, he found a slim sheaf of papers covered with his uncle's handwriting. In their haste to write the parlour and make it ready for mourners, his uncle's associates hadn't noticed it. One paper was set to the side as if more important than the others. On it was written 2 lines in strange, indecipherable Hebrew. It all looked very arcane, and he considered handing the whole stack over to the first rabbi he saw. But his uncle's handwriting exerted a visceral pull on him. He couldn't, not yet. It was all too fresh. Wearily, he tossed the papers into the empty leather satchel. He would sort through them later, once he had regained his sense of perspective. He lugged the box and the satchel back to his own tenement rooms and shoved them beneath a table. He was still sweating and nauseated, though he'd eaten barely anything for days. He vomited in the water closet and then collapsed onto his pallet. In the morning, one of his roommates found him soaked and shaking. A doctor was brought in. Perhaps a mild influenza, the doctor said, and within hours the entire building was quarantined, its doors impassable. They took Michael to the Swinburne Island Hospital, where he lay among the terrified and heartbroken immigrants turned away at Ellis Island, the dying and the misdiagnosed. His fever swelled. He hallucinated a fire on the ceiling, and then a writhing, dripping nest of snakes. He struggled to get away from them and realised he was tied into his bed. He cried out, and a cool, impartial hand came to rest on his forehead. Someone brought a glass of water to his lips. He drank what he could, then descended back into his terrible visions. Michael's were not the only cries of delirium in the ward. In a nearby bed lay a Prussian man in his 40s, who'd been hale and sound when he boarded the Baltica at its stop in Hamburg. He'd made it to Ellis Island without incident, and had been at the front of the line for the doctor's examination when he'd felt a tap on his shoulder. The man turned around and saw behind him a small, wizened-looking old man in a too large overcoat. The old man beckoned to him, obviously wishing to speak. He bent down closer to hear in the crowded hall, whereupon the old man whispered a string of meaningless, harshly babbling words in his ear. The man shook his head, trying to get across that he hadn't understood. But then he was shaking his head more violently, because the muttered syllables had taken up residence inside his head. They grew louder, ricocheting from one side of his skull to the other, buzzing like wasps. He put his fingers in his ears. "Please help me," he tried to say, but he couldn't hear his own voice over the din. The old man's face was all innocent puzzlement. Others in the line were beginning to stare. He clutched his head. The noise was impossible. He was drowning in it. And then he was falling to his knees, shouting incoherently. A froth began to form on his lips. Doctors and men in uniform were grabbing him now, prying back his eyelids, shoving a leather belt in his mouth. The last thing he saw before they wrapped him in a straitjacket and took him to Swinburne was the old man pausing at the unattended desk to stamp his own papers before disappearing into the crowd on the other side. The Bureau of Immigration officer looked over the papers in his hand and then scrutinised the man in front of him. He looked older than 64, to be sure, but he had that weathered peasant's look that meant he could be anywhere under 100. What year were you born? On the other side of the desk, the Yiddish translator bent and murmured in the old man's ear. 1835, the answer came back. Well, if he said so. The man's back was straight and his eyes were clear, and the health stamp was still drying on his papers. He'd already shown his wallet, which held $20 American and a few coins, enough to keep him from being a nuisance. There was no reason not to let him in. That name, though. Let's call you something more American, he said. It's for the best. And as the old man watched, confusion gathering in his eyes, the officer struck out Yehuda Shalman, and above it wrote Joseph Schall in a dark, square hand. Chapter 13. The Christmas season descended on Little Syria, with all its attendant decoration and feasts. Suddenly it seemed to the Djinni that Arbeli was always at church. For novena, the man would say, or to celebrate the Immaculate Conception, or for the revelation to St. Joseph. But what does any of that mean? The Djinni asked. And so, with a feeling of dread, Arbeli found himself giving the Djinni a potted history of the life of Christ and the founding of his church. This was followed by a long, convoluted, and at times quite bitter argument. Let me see if I understand correctly now, the Djinni said at one point. You and your relations believe that a ghost living in the sky can grant you wishes. That is a gross oversimplification, and you know it. And yet, according to men, we Djinn are nothing but children's tales. This is different. This is about religion and faith. And where exactly is the difference? Are you honestly asking or being deliberately insulting? I'm honestly asking. Arbeli sank a finished skillet into a tub of water. By now, both of them were heartily sick of skillets, and waited for the steam to clear. Faith is believing in something even without proof, because you know it in your heart to be true. I see. And before you released me from the flask, would you have said that you knew in your heart that Djinn do not exist? Arbeli frowned. I would have put it at a very low probability. And yet, look at me. Here I stand, making skillets. Does that not call your faith into question? Yes, look at you. You yourself are proof that labeling something as superstition doesn't necessarily make it so. But I've always existed. Djinn may not choose to be seen, but that doesn't mean we're imaginary. And we certainly don't ask to be worshipped. In any case, he said with relish, he had been saving this salvo for its proper moment. You yourself told me that sometimes you aren't certain there is a God. I never should have said that, muttered Arbeli. I was drunk. On a recent night, buoyed by their growing commercial success, Arbeli had decided to introduce his apprentice to arak. The anise-flavoured alcohol had no effect on the Djinni, only a pleasant taste and a sudden warmth as it burned away inside him. He'd been fascinated by the arak's transformation as Arbeli added water to the small glass, the liquor going from clear to cloudy white. He'd insisted on trying it over and over, diluting the arak drop by drop and watching the hazy, opaque tendrils extend themselves through the glass. But how does it work? He'd asked Arbeli. Don't know. The man had grinned, tossing back another of the Djinni's experiments. It just does. Because you were drunk, does that make it less true? Said the Djinni. Yes, liquor is an evil influence. And besides, even if I didn't believe, what would that change? You existed without the benefit of my belief. So does God without yours. But the truth was that Arbeli's faith rested on uncertain ground. Worse, the argument was forcing him to scrutinise his own shaky beliefs when all he wanted was the comfort of the familiar. At night, alone in his bed, doubt and homesickness weighed his heart and made him feel like weeping. Nevertheless, on Christmas Eve, he went to Mass. In the candlelit hall, he took communion with his neighbours, the wine-soaked bread heavy on his tongue, and strove to feel something of the miracle of the Christ child's birth. Afterward, at a dinner organised by the ladies of the church, he sat at a long table among the other unmarried men, and ate tabbouleh and flatbread and kibba that tasted nothing like his mother's. A couple of the men produced an oud and a drum, and they all danced a dabka. Arbeli joined in, less from real enthusiasm than because it would hurt too much not to. He left the dinner and walked back towards his tenement room. It was a bracing, frostbitten night. The air knifed at his lungs. Perhaps, he thought, he would have a glass of arak, just the one this time, and retire early. Then he saw that the lamp was still burning in the shop. Strange. Usually at this hour, the Djinni was out roaming the city, bedding young heiresses and doing whatever else it was he did. Arbeli entered to find the shop empty. He frowned. Didn't the Djinni know better than to leave the lamp burning? Irritated, he went to extinguish it. On the work table, inside the circle of lamplight, sat a small silver owl. Arbeli picked up the figurine and turned it over in his hands. The owl was perched on the stump of a tree, staring at him with enormous, wide-set eyes. The Djinni had used a tiny blade to carve out a ruff of startled feathers and a thin, pointed beak. In all, he'd contrived to make it the most indignant-looking owl Arbeli had ever seen. He laughed aloud, delighted. Not a Christmas present, surely. Was it meant for an apology or merely a whim? A bit of both, perhaps? Smiling, he pocketed the figurine and took himself to bed. The owl was indeed meant as an apology, but for more than Arbeli knew. The bickering about religion had taken its toll on the Djinni as well. Never before had humans seemed so foreign to him. Distantly, he understood that the subject was difficult for Arbeli to explain, tied as it was to the man's feelings for home and family. But then Arbeli would say something ridiculous, like when he had tried to explain how this god of theirs was somehow 3 gods and one at the same time. It left the Djinni drowning in a sea of exasperation. Certainly the man meant well, but the Djinni wanted to talk to someone else, someone who might understand his frustrations, even share them. Someone who, like him, was forced to hide away her strengths. He had no idea if she would even consent to speak with him, but he needed to know who she was. And so, as Arbeli entered his shop and discovered the waiting figurine, the Djinni was already retracing the route he had memorised in search of the woman made of clay. Over the weeks, the cold had deepened, and with it the golem's nighttime restlessness. At the end of each workday, she'd contrived to spend one or two more minutes in front of the fading ovens, soaking up the last of their heat. The walk home had become an unhappy march to an endless-seeming incarceration. One night she tried getting into her bed beneath the eiderdown, thinking it might warm her, but her restless limbs wouldn't allow it. She nearly tore the bedclothes apart in her rush to get out again. On Saturdays, her day off, she fought off the stiffness by walking the bounds of her neighbourhood, up and down the over-familiar streets. Rivington, Delancey, Broome, Grand, Hester, Forsyth, Allen, Eldridge, Orchard, Ludlow. Fur wreaths and red velvet bows had appeared in a few of the tenement windows. Vaguely she was aware that it was for a holiday, but that it was a Gentile affair and she wasn't supposed to take notice. She passed the innumerable synagogues, from humble storefront congregations to the soaring structures on Eldridge and Rivington. At each one, she felt the same outpouring of prayer, like a deep river with powerful currents. Sometimes it was so strong that she had to cross the street or risk being pulled under. She began to realize why the rabbi had never taken her to a service. It would be like stepping into a hurricane. On the western boundary of her walks, she would always pause and look down the block toward the Bowery. To her, the street was a sort of borderland, a gateway to the vast, dangerous expanse of the city. She'd only crossed it once, on the night she'd met the glowing man. She wondered where he was. Did he feel the cold like she did? Or did he drive it away by burning more brightly? Back and forth she'd walk, willing the sun not to set. But the earth insisted on turning, and before long she was home again, steeling herself for the night. Bored with sewing her one dress, she'd begun to take in clothes that needed mending or alterations. Most of her clients were her fellow boarders in the house, the clerks and accountants who'd never learned to thread a needle. They thought her awkward and spinsterish, if they thought of her at all, but even they noticed the precision of her stitches, the almost invisible mends. They recommended her to their friends and colleagues, and soon the Golem had more than enough piecework to occupy her fingers, if not her mind. One particularly cold night, she was repairing a rip in a pair of trousers when the needle fell from her stiff fingers. She tried to grab it, but fumbled, and the needle vanished. She searched the trousers, her own clothing, the floor, but couldn't find it. At last, a glint from the candlelight caught her eye, and there it was, sticking out of her right forearm. It had sunk in nearly half its length. She peered closer, dumbfounded. How had it happened? She'd driven it in by accident and not even noticed. Carefully, she plucked the needle from her arm and pulled back her sleeve. There was a tiny dark hole, its edge slightly raised where the needle had pushed the clay aside. She pressed the spot with her thumb and felt a twinge of discomfort. But already the puncture was seaming itself over, the clay spreading back into place. And when she removed her thumb, the mark was nearly gone. The Golem was fascinated. She'd grown used to thinking of her body as never changing. She didn't bruise when she bumped into the work table and never twisted her ankle on the ice as Mrs. Radson had done. Her hair didn't even grow. This was something new and unexplored. Her gaze fell on her satin pincushion and its dozens of long silver pins. Within minutes, she'd stuck them all in her arm to varying depths, a few nearly down to the head. It took a good deal of force. The clay that formed her was strong and thick and didn't give way easily. After denting her thumb on the pinheads, she took off her boot and used it as a hammer. Finally, she examined her work, touching each pin in turn. She'd laid them out in a neat grid along her left forearm, from the wrist to the elbow. All were held fast. She flexed and opened her hand, feeling the clay gather and pull around the pins near her wrist. There seemed to be no underlying structure, no bone or muscle and nerve. She was clay through and through. She removed a pin, prizing it out with her fingernails. Soon the hole had closed of its own accord. She pulled out another one and checked the clock. Only 3 minutes until there was nothing left but a dark spot. What if the hole was bigger? She took the pin and inserted it directly next to another one, making the hole twice as wide. The discomfort grew, but she ignored it. Then she removed both pins and watched. 8 minutes passed before the hole had closed over completely. How interesting. But what if she stuck 3 pins together, or 4? Or she could use something other than pins, something wider, The embroidery scissors! She snatched them from the sewing basket, closed her fist around the handles, and held them like a dagger above her wrist, ready to strike. Then, slowly, as though not to startle herself, she put the scissors down. What in the world was she doing? She had no idea how much her body could endure, how far it could be pushed. What if she'd permanently maimed herself? And if the hole had indeed closed, then what next? Would she slice off her own arm out of boredom? No need to worry herself with thoughts of others discovering and destroying her. She would destroy herself soon enough, piece by piece. She pulled each pin from her arm and replaced them in the pincushion. Soon the only damage was a faint grid of blemishes. She checked the clock. Only 2 in the morning. There were still hours left to fill, and already her fingers were beginning to twitch. How long could she keep on like this? Years? Months? Weeks? Days? You will go mad before long, said a voice in her mind, and put all in danger. Her hand came up to touch the locket, and then faltered. She shook her head distractedly. Then she wrapped her cloak tighter about herself and glanced out at the street below. The glowing man was strolling up the sidewalk towards her boarding house. She stared, shocked. What was he doing on her street? Had he followed her home that night? No, perhaps it was a coincidence. He might be headed anywhere. Warily, she watched his approach. He wore a dark coat, but no hat, even though it was freezing cold. Near the boarding house, he slowed and then stopped. He glanced about as if checking for onlookers. And then he raised his head and looked directly at her window. Their eyes met. She flew back from the window, nearly stumbling against her bed. She'd been discovered, hunted down. She clutched at the locket, waiting for the pounding on the door, the angry mob. But the street remained silent. There was no knock at the door, no approaching wave of fearful anger. She crept back to the window's edge and peered out. He was still there, alone, leaning against the lamppost. As she watched, he rolled himself a cigarette and then, without benefit of a match, touched his finger to the end and inhaled. All this without glancing at her window. He was, she realised, certain of his audience, and he was enjoying himself. Her panic subsided, was replaced by ire. How dare he follow her home? What right did he have? And yet, how many times had she thought to go to Washington Street and seek him out? And now here he was under her window, and she had no idea what to do about it. For almost an hour she watched as he stood there, for all the world as though he had nothing better to do than hold up the lamppost and smoke cigarettes. He nodded at the occasional passers-by, who all stared at his uncovered head and thin coat. Then, as if struck by a sudden impulse, he pulled something from his pocket. It was roughly the size of an apple, though not as round, and it glinted in the thin pool of gaslight. He held it cupped in his hands, and for a few long moments his hands blazed so brightly it almost hurt to look at them. Then from another pocket he withdrew a long, thin stick, pointed at the end like a needle. He held the object up and peered at it, and began to poke at it gently with the stick. Curious, despite her caution, she crept closer to the window and watched as he worked. Every so often he frowned and rubbed a thumb over whatever he had done, as if erasing a mistake. She realised that the light inside him didn't shine beyond his own body, for although his hands were half as bright as the gas lamp, the thing he held remained in shadow. Finally, he slowed his work and then stopped. He held up the object for inspection, turning it this way and that, before bending down and setting it next to the lamppost. Then, without so much as a backward glance, he walked away down the street again, the way he'd come. The golem waited 10 minutes. Then she waited 5 more. The day was about to begin. Already the traffic on the sidewalk was increasing. 1, 2, 3 people walked past the lamppost. Soon someone would notice whatever it was he'd left there and claim it for themselves, or it would be kicked into the gutter and lost, and then she would never know what it was. She grabbed her cloak and rushed down the stairs. At the front door she paused. Had he doubled back to lie in wait for her, having baited his trap? She opened the door a crack and poked her head around, but saw no glowing faces, only ordinary men and women. She went to the lamppost and retrieved the object, examining it in the gaslight. It was a small silver bird, still warm to the touch. He'd formed it as though it was sitting on the ground, its feet tucked up underneath itself. Its round body tapered to a short spray of tail feathers. Small carvings and indentations created the suggestion of plumage. Its head was turned to one side, watching her intently with smooth, half-globe eyes. He had made this with his bare hands while standing beneath her window. Thoroughly perplexed, she brought the bird back to her room, placed it on her writing desk, and stared at it until it was time to leave for work. That morning, the golem burned a pan of cookies for the first time. At the register, she miscounted 2 customers' change and gave a woman prune danishes instead of cheese. The mistakes mortified her, though everyone else was amused. She was so celebrated for her exactness that catching her in error seemed a fortuitous event, like a shooting star. Anna, of course, enjoyed it to the hilt. "What's his name?" she whispered as the golem passed her work table. "What?" Startled, the golem stared at the girl. "Whose name?" "Oh, no one's." Anna smiled, satisfied as a cat. "Forget I said anything." After that, the golem went to the water closet to collect herself. She would not let the glowing man unnerve her. She would be calm and controlled, her best self. She would act the way the rabbi would want her to act. She came home that night and positioned herself by the window, waiting. Finally, at nearly 2 in the morning, he appeared from around the corner. Again, he was alone. He returned to his spot next to the lamppost and again gave every indication of staying there for the night. Enough of this, she thought. She put on her cloak, then tiptoed down the staircase and quietly opened the front door.
I knew you were going to end there. Whoa, whoa. Oh, that was lovely.
Yay!
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Nice. Nice, fun and nice.
How did you hear about this book? Who recommended it, or like, how did you know it existed?
I read it about like 3 years ago now. It was yeah, it just cropped up on my Amazon recommends, which, you know, like, I know that they are the devil, but also cheap books, and I go through a lot of them, and so the algorithm is like spot on. Like, it's pretty good at knowing what I like by this point. And yeah, it was just, it threw up. It was like, you might like this, and I was like, maybe, maybe I will. Maybe I'll give it a go. Bought it, liked it, and then yeah, I've been thinking about it as a potential Storytime book for a while now. but just because it's so chunky, I hadn't got around to rereading it. So I was like, well, I don't want to do it until I've reread it. And then reread it a little bit ago and was like, yeah, let's do this one.
It's so good.
I'm so glad you're enjoying it. And I'm very, very excited because I'd been wanting to do Feet of Clay after this anyway. So I'm very excited for the narrative continuity, the thematic, the kind of Golem through line there.
Love it. Good. I love it.
Quite impressively different golems.
Or are they? We'll have to find out. Oh, I'm so glad you're enjoying it. I'm really enjoying it. I'm having a lovely time reading it.
Oh, there you go. You've even put the cat to sleep nicely.
Oh, that's what we are all here for.
Yeah.
Yeah, she enjoys listening to the book as well.
Oh my God, she's so beautiful. What's her name?
Suki.
Oh, she's so lovely. Very, very here for cats. Storytime cats. Cats and bears. Very cute. Oh, okay, right. We should say goodbye to the catch-up crew because I can't stick around tonight. But bye, catch-up crew. Hope you enjoyed it. We love you. Good night. Good night.